We are relatively short of time, so yes, I'm I co-head our global TMT practice here at Hogan Lovells. So I'm going to ask Richard during the break whether coordinating 700 lawyers in 6 continents and getting them to try and agree with each other is something that can yet be substituted by an AI-empowered system. But this morning my job is extremely simple. I'm just here to introduce our panel and then to help with a few questions at the end. So on my far right is Professor Sofia Olhede, I hope I've got that right, who is a Professor of Statistics and Senior Research Associate at UCL. Then we've got Rob McCargow, who's AI Program Leader at PwC. Dana-Denis Smith helps a legal business Obelisk support, which I think uses technology to match lawyers to tasks, basically, as I understand it. And Laura Robinson is the Deputy Director of Retail Services and Sector Hubs at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I'm not going to say anything more because you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to them. So I'll hand over to Sofia.
Okay, well, hopefully that's all. So I'm going to give a little bit of a from the top to the bottom view of why I think we need to really work on the language and the communication to make sense of the use of AI in society. So just to give you the bird's eye view to get further down, AI is not a particularly well-developed concept. When people use the word in common parlance, they mean anything from data science, which is making sense of the deluge of data we've been subjected to machine learning and computational statistics, which is the methods we make sense of that data, to automation, how we automatically use these to implement decisions on the basis of the data. AI, as Richard already mentioned, is artificial intelligence in contrast to natural intelligence that you would find in humans or animals, and it's usually split up into 2 different sections of general intelligence and narrow intelligence, where narrow intelligence is solving particular concrete tasks, and that's what we have in front of us in the near term and need to sort out. Approaches to doing AI differ widely, and they can be logical rules. If you see A, you do B. If you have something with 4 legs that says moo, it's probably a cow. Or they can be statistical and based on data. And developing either set of rules needs to be based on principles of how to approach that problem. And that's where we need a lot more language, imagery, and better communication. Because the devil is in the detail. We need to communicate how we make these decisions and how we make sense of data. And 2 things are vital in making that language happen. The first is the method or the framework where you develop an algorithm or a set of rules. And they can either be explanatory, you're trying to explain what you expect to see in the data, or it can be predictive. You don't care about the explanation, you just want to understand the next set of observations that are going to come in. What is the next patient that's going to come into your waiting room? You want to predict that patient so you have the right medication, but you might not care why that patient is making its way into your waiting room. Secondly, and this is incredibly important, we need to find ways to communicate on whether a method is doing well or not. And I think this is going to be key in understanding how we judge an algorithm and its performance. So the choices matter a great deal. And they're not just details for the boffins, and that's why we need to have events like this. The explanatory framework is the traditional way of trying to understand data in general. And there you actually try to build a mechanism which seeks to find the causes of what you see. So you might think to yourself, okay, I'm trying to predict the weather of tomorrow. I'm going to use past temperatures. I'm going to use fluid dynamics. I'm going to do all of this to build a model where I can understand why we're getting certain future values. And that's really key because it's linked into how humans think. And I would re-echo Richard's comment earlier is that artificial intelligence shouldn't really mimic human intelligence, because what humans are good at are seeing big patterns and making simplifications. What machines are good at are repetitive tasks that they can perform again and again and again without making any errors. And I think this is really where we find it hard to understand when we want to find the language to explain what a method is doing, because we're used to that high-level view where we have causes that make something happen, where we can explain the outcome in terms of those causes. Well, if we're building an incredibly complicated model using maths and computers, then we're actually having something that's so complicated, like Richard's decision tree that we saw earlier, that we can't come up with a simple explanation of what's going on. And a lot of the current algorithms that are best performing are based on these sorts of frameworks. And you can't just say, I want explanation at all cost, because then you'll have to put up with the fact that the methods you develop will actually perform worse. And that comes back to, okay, you have the framework, you have the way you want to design a method, predictive or explanatory. The second is, how do you train the method once you've decided what framework you actually want to be using? And that comes back to having an error metric. And you might say, oh, that sounds all like techno-babble. But what it actually means is, how do we decide if we're performing well? And that comes back to really important questions. Do we care about mean performance? I.e., on average, if we take a random person that's being subjected to the system, is that going to have a very good experience on average? Or do we care about worst performance? Or do we care about what happens with more extreme people who are not really the average person an algorithm might expect to see? And that comes back to having to mix up and understand how mathematical concepts and decisions on error or bad performance sort of mix in with legal and ethical framework. And that's what we're going to have to work out, how to make those two scenarios really communicate. Because the devil is in the detail. What you're going to get out will exactly depend on what you put in, so you can have good or bad quality data. But it's exactly the way you design the algorithm, what you tell it to give you, in conjunction with what's a bad outcome, which we will train the algorithm to avoid. And that's where we all need to do a lot more talking. So the cost functions matter a great deal as we're trying to solve these sorts of problems. So I think over the next few years, these are the sorts of concepts that we'll see mapped out. And exactly events like this will sort of prove the preamble to doing that. And it's going to end up having us develop a common framework where people like you can explain to people like me the principles you want to implement, so I can go away and make up the math and the technologies that actually implement those principles. And if we think that it's really all equivalent, as long as you just have some techie solution that seems to have a good output, I don't care about the details because they're way beyond me, then we're going to go off and develop something random, and it will perform well on average, because we've all been trained to develop methods that perform well on average. And then you're going to have extreme scenarios which have very bad outcomes. And if I'm recommending books to you on Amazon, well, you don't care. But if I'm recommending operations to be implemented on a patient, or I'm helping to run a nuclear power plant, you are going to care a great deal. Thank you.
Rob. Thanks very much for having me along today. As Christina said, I think it's fantastic to see so many friends in the audience. I think it's my 6th speaking event of the week, so the voice is starting to go. And in fact, there's a bit of imposter syndrome here. I mean, Richard spoke to the great number of bodies proliferating in this space. We've got representatives from the Hogan Lovells Institute here, great think tanks like Reform, and wonderful academics. I get stuck on the end of Twitter threads at the weekend that I don't understand a fraction of around the philosophy of AI. So I think from my point of view, though, the important bit now is the rich diversity we've now pulled together in this community. I think this is a particular UK trait in the countries I go to. It's quite unique. But also the next step, I think, in this journey is, what are we doing this for? We're doing this for our customers, and we're doing it for citizens and the public at large. And I'll just pick out, I think it was Stephen Cave from the Levy Human Centre's favourite headline at the launch of the Lord's AI report last week. And it was the Sun who said, quote, "Boffins urged to prevent fibbing robots from staging Terminator-style apocalypse." So the very essence of the way we handle this discussion is so important. The language we use without being patronising has to be accessible and inclusive and engaging. And I think the report that the Lords produced was excellent, and I think the AI code with its 5 principles was also really good. And there's great work going on around public engagement with the Royal Society, the RSA, DOS Everyone, Martha Lane Fox's business. But I think what I wanted to just sort of highlight today is, what do we actually do? How do we practically put ethics into the way we adopt this technology on the ground floor? As businesses start to embrace this technology with a voracious appetite at warp speed increasingly, where the rubber starts hitting the road, what do we actually do? And I think the biggest concern is, we've seen use cases of minimal consequence not work out so well. What's the worst that happens when a movie algorithm recommends a daft movie? You keep scrolling till you find something more appropriate, like Her, for example, a great movie. But as we started seeing this being applied to more consequential issues that affect society and business at large, from criminal justice algorithms, from recruiting algorithms that determine who gets selected, etc., we've got real risk of consequential harm, reputational damage to business, regulatory damage to our organisations, and commercial damage as well. So what I really wanted to sort of just frame initially and very briefly was some of the various bits that we're kind of looking at together. We've got Raja from the IEEE here today as well, doing some great work. So from the top, I mean, clearly, as I think Richard briefly mentioned, corporate governance and oversight at board level and then the regulators. Who's holding businesses and technologists to account and qualified to ask the right questions? We've seen this in the US Congress and Senate last week or 2 weeks ago. There's a real need now to upskill and educate and improve awareness and capability at board and independent board level. I think the next bit is around the standards. What are the standards? What are the guide rails that are guiding teams to embed ethical thinking into their work? I'll give you one example. We work a lot with regards to risk assurance of AI. I did a workshop at an event last year, and we produced a proposed framework of how do you build in trust and transparency into AI deployments. And on the one hand, we had a great philosopher and academic saying, Rob, I can't see the word ethics in your framework. It should be in every single step of the way. And I do agree with that. On the other hand, there was someone from a DevOps background that was saying, I can't be encumbered by an ethical committee deciding my every step. I'm under pressure to release code and move very quickly. So how do we square that circle is really important in practical terms. I think also this speaks very much to the topic of the day and this panel in particular, the multidisciplinary approach. And I think this is a great opportunity, the ability for corporate functions to work together. This goes way beyond just a technology team here. You need people that can communicate to your staff why you're doing this and to your customers why you're doing this. You need people that can assess it for risk and compliance. You need this, HR people to ask the questions. How does it affect our staff? How does it affect our people? Right through to the very essence of the purpose of your organisation about why you're doing this. And I think this is a great opportunity. And I think I will briefly speak to Richard's book. I think it was the very first book I read when I moved into this role, The Future of the Professions. And there's been a lot of concern about the end of the professions, and the particular line, I'm going to butcher it and paraphrase it badly here. All professions agree that things like AI will substantially disrupt the professions, apart from their own profession, which of course is far too complicated to cope with. And I've taken that, I think, on board. But on the other side of things, I think the very essence of what is inculcated into the curricula of the professions, that professional skepticism, that critical reasoning, ability to ask the hard questions, weigh up the risk, I think offers a really wonderful array of new tasks in the professions and new jobs, therefore, and new careers of the future. So to sort of wrap things up, really, I agree with what Tim said there. I think the report did a great job of that. Stakeholder and public trust and ethics are the beating heart of this AI revolution. And we certainly cannot afford to continue adopting the move fast and break things mantra. However, the stakes are too high, but we do have to move decisively, but we have to move with care to embrace AI and task it with solving the most important problems facing business and society. Thank you.
Dana.
Hi.
You have to...
Hi. I'm going to focus on talking from a supplier perspective. We are a 7-year-old business. We started by being totally unautomated in 2010, and we have moved to building our own platform ourselves in the last 2.5 years. I want to tell you how it feels to be labeled a disruptor, and also how it feels to be in the middle of all the noise, and how it feels to basically build something yourself. Because I think very often, and I absolutely agree about all the language and the linguistics around this, I completely agree about the distinction between automating and artificial intelligence. And as lawyers, we should be able to really label things correctly. Having come in the market, we had this very clear human-first approach. There were a lot of people that were being left behind by the profession because they needed to basically participate in the future of work, which wasn't available in the legal profession when we started at scale. So we now have 1,500 lawyers that we've all pre-vetted and onboarded on our platform, and we've built our own technology to allow for fast matchmaking, basically between particular jobs that come in and their skill sets. What have we learned? What I've learned, the first thing, as a trained lawyer and a non-technologist, is that you really have to start being very logical in your thinking. And technologists have a very clear approach to what they need and the instructions. Very much as you said, the instructions you give, leads to what you get. So unless the instructions are understood and they are clearly labeled, you will get some very strange outcomes. So you'll have all the wrong skills coming up for a job that appears to be able to be doable, but the person won't be able to deliver. So I find that being in this space of technology is very, very similar to being an entrepreneur, actually. You have to be really up for what I call deferred gratification. You've got to be in it for the long term, and you've got to be able to reap the rewards at the very end, having tried many things to make it work. I'm very troubled by the language of disruption and this scaremongering going on at the moment, because I think we are seeing technology as a category that is a threat to us rather than something that enables us to basically step up our performance. And I traveled to Japan recently, and I'm really in awe with how they've incorporated technology and new ways, especially around machine learning, which is not artificial intelligence, into improving their day-to-day ability to deliver along services, but also to live. I find their methodology of not fighting technology a really inspiring way of, advancing as humanity. So that's one thing. I like to see the language of disruption disappear and a way of collaborating with technology to improve our performance and the human race overall. And then I will leave to academics to discuss the ethical aspects, because I'm not an expert. I'm just an amateur with interest in that space. The other thing is to say that I have followed the legal tech space that's really taken off, I would say, in the last 3 years. And I call it the big noise. I find it very difficult to distinguish, and I think it's very much, in a way, a tribute to the disaggregation discussions that started it all in the legal sector, is that we've ended up with a lot of features, none of which are integrated. And so I'm not really sure what we are delivering to, our businesses. That's the space we operate in. We're a B2B provider exclusively, and I'm not really sure how we are improving service in this very feature-based way. So I like to see the debate moving into aggregation, into experience, into things that actually other professions are doing much better. And as I said, I will leave the AI ethical debate to those that are maybe much more deeply involved in creating the framework. But as somebody that is trying to deliver more better in a more effective way with a capability that involves technology and humans, which I think are very important, we don't leave behind in this equation. I find the noise is just deafening and it's not really improving outcomes. Thank you.
And now, Laura, but I think, Sofia, we've got a video to play first.
Yes, if I can say a bit
Yep,
first.
please do.
Okay, is that working? Yes, so good morning, everyone. So I'm really excited to be here this morning, because as Richard summed it up, really, AI is very much here to stay, whether we like it or not. And I think other speakers were talking about the desire not to fight it. So the government ministers that I work for very much have a desire to position the UK as a world leader in AI. And many of you, I hope, would have seen that yesterday, my Secretary of State, Greg Clark, actually announced nearly £1 billion public and private investment into AI. So this is the AI sector deal involving both government and over 50 companies. And the idea there is to really sort of strengthen the UK's position in this area and make us that world leader that we want to be. It also includes 1,000 new AI PhDs. So our hope there really is that we can create a pipeline of future Richards to ensure that once Richard has retired and is enjoying a sort of feet up moment, that we've got many more people following on in his good work. So that was sort of the overall big picture that I wanted to mention to you, and I will send round the links to the announcement yesterday in case you didn't see it. There's also a particular element relevant to lawyers and legal services that I wanted to flag. So previously, other governments in the past, when they've looked at funding for innovation, they've tended to focus quite a lot on manufacturing. Perhaps, I suppose I would say, because with things like lean, it's quite easy to see how we might make process improvements, whereas they've done much less on services. So as someone who works on services within government, I'm actually now feeling really excited about lots of new opportunities. So recently, we had our government chief scientist do a blanket review into the future of services. I'm holding a copy up now, and I will again send a link round to all of you on that. And that document has been quite important in gathering the evidence base for why government should invest much more in this area. And then connected to that, through our industrial strategy, we have a series of challenge funds, and I'm going to play a video about that in a moment. And I'm really pleased that one of them relates to how we look at exploiting artificial intelligence within the professions. So we currently have £20 million for a pilot where we want to see businesses and academics working together to see what can be done to harness the great power of AI in accountancy, insurance and legal services. Some of my colleagues did suggest that maybe I should have sent a bot to do this rather than doing it myself. I'm afraid I haven't got that technological know-how to do it, but we do have a video about the fund. So if we could play that now, please. If that's possible. Yeah. So thank you for bearing with that and watching that. So just to conclude, really, to remind you that as part of that Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, we're delighted that we have an initial £20 million for a pilot looking at how we apply artificial intelligence to develop next generation services in accountancy, in legal services and in insurance. I very much hope that people in this room will be excited about this opportunity and will want to get involved, because we're also in a very rare situation that those of you who know government well will know doesn't happen very often, in that this is an initial pilot, but Treasury are actually quite keen to invest further money in this. This does not happen regularly. So please do get involved and show that there is real demand, prove them right, and I'm sure we'll be seeing even bigger challenges coming along in the future. Thank you very much.
That's great. That's so much food for thought. And so now we've got time for questions. Perhaps I could just kick off and warm people up by asking one question. So we've heard both a business and a technological perspective. We've heard some legal perspectives. We've seen quite a lot in the media which might imply that there are question marks over the way in which technology-driven businesses sometimes govern themselves. This session's about a multidisciplinary approach, and it's the boardroom where businesses, the multidisciplinary aspects, the HR, the legal, the business and so on come together. So I just wonder whether any of you have got a view on which is more important or perhaps more difficult, helping the boardroom to understand enough about technology to govern it, or helping technologists to understand enough about corporate governance and ethics to govern themselves.
I'll start with that. I don't think I think that the two are of equal weight. I don't think there's a dichotomy on this. I think we talk about this sort of tech-savvy humanist approach to some of what we do. You know, the sort of the moving together of the previous people that haven't had technology requirements to realise it's a fundamental requirement of their job now. So I don't think you can distinguish it. But I've seen people starting to come together now, and I think, as evidenced in the audience today, there's some fantastically gifted people that are moving from philosophy to tech and from business into regulation and trying to bring all that together. So one thing I forgot to mention also was around multidisciplinary diversity, but also societal diversity in the teams both governing and building this as well. And I think I just wanted to say congratulations to Sofia and Christina and the organisers for a wonderfully diversely represented event, and in fact 56% female. And it's nice not to be on a manual for the first time in a while, so well done.
If I could add a little bit of that. I mean, the main problem is that technology is advancing so rapidly, and there is a concern that if you try to set up standards or norms, if you do it before you see where technology is going, you might not make the right decisions, so you end up in a catch-22. I think we can't wait for everything just to shake out, but a very promising direction that I've been observing is that a lot of companies are setting up their own ethical review boards. And I think coupled together with the investment of Ada Lovelace, etc., it's about connecting all of those initiatives together so that we get standards, and standards is what we need to be able to really have people, when they're sitting down as developers, figuring out how should they be approaching the problem so they don't have to get the entire ethics review board in for every bit of the development.
Okay.
I was at a recent event, and it's such a good question, because what really struck me then was that we absolutely spoke very different languages. So the technologists just went on and on about their very technical, whatever they were building, and the people that were not technologists had no idea what was going on. And so at the end, it was an ed tech event, that one, and at the end of it, somebody said, what is the future of education? And the conclusion really was we should all do philosophy as a compulsory subject, because we really need to teach how to think, and that will then feed into how you approach all these very, very difficult questions, the ethics obviously being a part of philosophy, but really that should be the common education that maybe brings together technologists with everybody else that doesn't code and makes them think about the same challenges together in the same language, because really we are very worlds apart in terms of how we communicate, including with my tech team. They say stuff that I just want them to stop and translate. And unless we understand the users, the ones that are communicating with the wider world, understand that, we won't be able really to get the right decisions. It will always be a struggle to get adoption, really.
Yeah. Ooh. I suppose just to build on what Dana, is that working? Is it? Sorry. Technical hitch there. So to build on what Dana was saying, I was quite struck by you were talking about the two different types of languages that are being spoken and the lack of understanding between the two. I would say that from my perspective, it's key that we do try and bridge that divide, because when you look at how productive businesses are, generally the most productive businesses within the economy are ones where they have a diversity of thought and when they can bring in experts from many different sectors together to work. So I suppose my plea really is, can we do much more to collaborate to make sure that our technologists are involved in what we're doing as businesses, but also then that businesses are involving technologists. And I hope in our own small way, through things such as the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, that the government is doing what it can to try and incentivise and enable that to happen. But ultimately it is up to business to decide that it wants to do it as well.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the floor, and if you're the supplier of an artificially intelligent sound system, you can speak to us later.
So a microphone, should we speak up?
I think there's a microphone on its human way to you.
Andrew, is that one?
No.
I'm loving the tech.
Does that work?
No. Just shout.
I'll just shout. So, my name's Andrew Dunkley. I work for BLM as head of analytics, and my team is developing predictive algorithms in the volume mitigation space. I just wanted to pick up on one of Rob's comments about the tension between the incentive to ship code and the time needed to think about the ethics of this. Because in my part of the market, quite a lot of that code has already been shipped. There are already offerings out there that are with zero lawyer input, valuing, assessing claims on sort of immediate receipt of claims documentations and taking action towards the settlement of those claims. So when we have this conversation about ethics, we're not talking about something that what should happen in the future. We're talking about something that's already happening now. there's lots of teams like mine out there in the market working away, developing and trying to shift code. How do we make sure that the ethics debate and the ethics thinking keeps up in a really practical sense? How do we make sure that all those teams are doing thinking about the ethics as they try to shift code?
So, I mean, I think you raised one important distinction. There's a lot of talk about the ethics of AI or AI ethics, and this sort of speaks to this wider conflation of the what opportunities and damage is being expressed today and in the next year or two ahead, versus that longer-term debate around, the singularity, the sort of existential threat piece, the sentience of this technology. And as Richard pointed, this stuff's pretty stupid for the time being and for quite some time to come. But that doesn't mean it's not capable of great damage. And this lack of interpretability and the black box nature of this technology is of serious concern. And as it starts, as I said before, going towards more consequential use cases, the regulators are starting to take this deadly seriously now. So we have to build in transparency into this. I think it was Joanna Bryson in Parliament last night, some of the guys in the audience were here last night, saying, well, to get transparency, the best way of doing that with systems that are quite opaque in their nature is to make sure we've got accountability, and accountability for organisations and teams to be aware of the power of their actions as well. On a more practical sense, I think Raja from the IEEE's here, we've been working a lot over the last 2 years on much more practical codes to help educate practitioners. We're some way away from lawyers and accountants needing to be professionally certified in this field, but that might happen. But for the time being, I just point to the IEEE's recently launched online piece of education on putting your tech teams through on ethical training. So there are some practical steps to do for the time being, but part of that ability to ask the hard questions with diversity of thought and diversity, multidisciplinary teams is quite important.
I think also it's important here to separate out a few issues. So on one hand, many of the recent problems that have arisen is to do with data governance and data proliferating in unfortunate ways it never should have, versus code being designed to take automated decisions and perhaps not making decisions that we think are ethical. So I think we are trying to catch up with things that have already happened, especially in terms of data proliferation. I mean, a lot of data is already out there. You can't just put the genie back into the box. But we are also where we are. So I think it's a question of government, industry, and academia coming together to take the next steps to, I think, connect ethics frameworks so we're not having isolated silos that are developing separately.
We've probably got time for one more quick question, or possibly two if they're really quick and have a yes/no answer. Over here first.
Nora Neela-John, Institute of Advanced Legal Studies. Jumping the gun a little bit there on the yes/no, but I'll try and frame it just so. Just following up from a really important point that Dana raised and Laura, and also the data ethics point that Sofia raised, about the issue of multidisciplinarity and also the need to have a common language talking about AI and ethics. And just taking a more practical step forward with that, would the panel have a recommendation as to how to improve consistency in the sharing of knowledge and the development of consistent industry standards on these ethics boards? So for example, and as an academic lawyer trying not to sound too self-serving about this, do you think there should be A, a lawyer on every ethics review board, and B, a computer scientist, for example? What is yes or no?
Yeah.
I think there definitely needs to be a technologist on every ethics review board. Not wanted to say self-serving either, but if you do have to implement something and action it, if you don't understand the technological barriers which are hardwired into the problem, how can you progress? But on the other hand, how could you progress without an understanding of the higher principles or the logics that should be involved in how you phrase these problems? That's why it needs to be multidisciplinary. And I think the main barrier there is something we all have to develop together. It's finding a common language so that we can explain what we do in enough detail. Because I think at the moment, the conversations are not really meshing up together. We've said, oh, we bring in all these fancy words, we've got deep learning, we've got neural networks with 12 layers, blah, 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 blah. But what needs to be explained is exactly how much sense can we make of the methods we're using to extract things from data? What are the principles we're demanding that the algorithm should obey when we're selecting certain parameters or certain choices? So it's coming to that middle ground where we're specific enough so it's not just all mumbo jumbo, but still not so specific that it becomes mumbo jumbo again, right? So I think that language needs to be developed, or we can't come up with either ethical principles or laws, because it's all meaningless without the devil that's in the detail. And that relates both to data, because we've seen a lot that as you combine sources of data, you can learn things that people never intended to share with other people. So there's sort of the statistics of sampling and privacy, but there's also all the technicalities of machine learning. And until we take the time to explain it in a way so that it can be matched up with legal ethical frameworks, nothing's going to work.
Okay, I thought that was such a perfect answer. Unless Rob's only got one word, I think Sofia's going to push it on.
I've got a very brief word. I think we need management consultants on these boards because, to quote, we've got all the best words.
Perfect. I'm sorry to move it along. I know there were lots more questions, but we've got so much more content coming up, and Sofia's keen to move us on quite rightly. So I'd really like to thank the panel and hand over to the next session.